Alright, as the last bonus video, what I wanted to do was to give you a walkthrough on how I might take notes on self-compassion, especially if I was preparing for a certain final exam question. So in particular, what I want to talk through is the what, the why, and the how of self-compassion. So just as a review, let's begin with what is self-compassion. Well, we talked about how self-compassion essentially consists of three different elements: self-kindness in contrast to self-judgment, common humanity in contrast to self-isolation, and a mindful awareness versus a tendency to over-identify. Now note, there should be a link here. I told you I'd try to note some links between one virtue and another. There's a link here between this virtue of self-compassion and the virtue of mindfulness, or the capacity of mind. So what is self-kindness? Well, self-kindness is my ability to view my failures as simply one element of my being a work in progress. In other words, oftentimes this involves experiencing my own failures and flaws, the kind of limitations that I have, as if from the perspective of a friend. And we'll find this is actually similar to one of the hows, how I go about practicing self-compassion. What is the common humanity dimension? Well, in common humanity, I see my problems as being like others' problems. And in fact, my suffering itself makes me a part of the common humanity. It doesn't make me different or unique or isolated from other people. In fact, I am a part of the world, all of whom suffer. And in fact, this common humanity involves an acceptance that life is imperfect, and so are we. The third dimension, the mindful awareness dimension of this, is in which I become curious about my suffering. And because of this, I can avoid either the extreme of suppressing my emotions or denying them and sometimes even projecting them outwards. Instead, what I can do is to stay with my painful feelings. And what makes self-compassion different from mere mindfulness is that with self-compassion, I can cherish myself in the midst of feeling this pain. Now, we talked about a lot of things that self-compassion is not. To review, self-compassion is not the same thing as self-esteem. In fact, the two have very different correlates. Self-esteem is not self-indulgence. It's not a tendency to make excuses for the self. In fact, self-compassion in some ways is the opposite of these, as it promotes many behaviors that self-indulgence and excuse-making tend to inhibit. We'll talk about those under the why section. Self-compassion is not self-pity, because self-pity, instead of opening us up, tends to close us off to other people. Self-pity involves my seeing my own problems and flaws as unique and as isolating me from other people. As such, self-pity produces more loneliness, self-absorption, and a tendency to withdraw from others around me. These are all very different than the tendencies of self-compassion. And finally, self-compassion is not overlooking my faults. In fact, some would argue that self-compassion enables me to better see my faults without fearing the self-criticism that comes from inside. So why develop self-compassion? Well, it turns out those who practice self-compassion tend to be more curious about the suffering of others. In other words, instead of walling themselves off from others, they find the ability to engage with the suffering of others. As a result of this impact, they tend to show greater levels of compassion, lower levels of self-pity, and lower levels of brooding about misfortune. Some researchers link this lower levels of brooding to the decreased symptomatology that we see in people who practice self-compassion. People high or who practice self-compassion tend to show lower levels of depression, stress, the symptoms of rumination or perfectionism. Self-compassionate people tend to show decreases in body shame and a fear of failure. And they show lower levels of anxiety. Remember, we talked about anxiety tends to be a force that can tend to promote that ethic of security. In other words, makes me move away from my neighbor and see a narrower group of people in the world as my neighbor. So the more self-compassion can diminish anxiety, the greater hold it gives us over whether we migrate towards an ethic of security or an ethic of compassion and imagination. Furthermore, People who practice self-compassion tend to decrease shame, and that comes in part from counteracting the belief that things shouldn't be happening. In self-compassion, remember, I accept that these kind of suffering moments are simply a part of what it means to be human. Turns out self-compassion, at least some argue, can enable mindfulness in much the same way that we saw mindfulness enable self-compassion. So note the backwards link here, that self-compassion can promote mindfulness. This is because sometimes when we're too upset to regulate our attention, it may help to just acknowledge our pain, and that can enable us to express some self-kindness to ourselves. Turns out self-compassionate people decrease in the amount of social comparisons they make. They tend to show lower levels of ego-defensive behavior. They show lower levels of contingent self-worth and higher levels of stable self-worth. In other words, they don't place their worth on things that can fluctuate. They tend to show lower levels of anxiety, especially when confronting their own weaknesses. And in these moments, they tended to use fewer first-person pronouns, and they tended to use more collective pronouns. So they would use words like we and us when they were talking about their weaknesses. People who practice self-compassion show lower levels of retaliation, and they tend to show a lower need for cognitive closure. This is fancy psych speak for the need to be right all the time. They show greater levels of motivation to apologize. So far from excuse making, it turns out practicing self-compassion actually increases taking responsibility. People who practice self-compassion show a higher level of commitment to not repeating their own harmful behaviors again. They show lower levels of self-pity, and they show higher levels of well-being on a number of different indices. Indices that include higher life satisfaction, greater happiness, greater self-confidence and optimism, higher levels of curiosity, and greater levels of creativity. Turns out self-compassionate people show an increased motivation to learn and grow and try again, and this is in part because they feel better about trying again after they've failed. This is a possible link that we can make with that quest approach to life, in which falling down is seen as good. Self-compassionate people show greater levels of emotion regulation, and we can actually witness this at the physiological level by seeing an increased heart rate variability, which is a good quality, and an increased ability to down-regulate their negative emotions. They also show lower levels of latent cortisol in their blood and a higher level of insula activation. I want to make another note here. Remember, the insula, as we'll talk about next week, is one of the key areas of the brain involved with empathy. And in fact, as we'll find out later, self-compassion tends to promote higher levels of empathy. Self-compassionate people practice greater amounts of healthy behaviors, including healthy eating, more sleep, and greater amounts of exercise. They tend to show higher levels of conscientiousness, one of the big 5 traits that's actually associated with success in jobs and academics. One of the qualities of this kind of conscientiousness is that individuals who practice self-compassion still feel guilt, but it's shame-free guilt. In other words, it's guilt about what they've done, not about who they are. Self-compassionate individuals tend to show greater levels of forgiveness, and their partners report that they show higher levels of supportive relational behaviors. So how do we go about practicing self-compassion? We talked about a couple. One intervention is to practice shame resilience, which involves 4 different dimensions. One is that people resilient to shame tend to know what shame is. In other words, you can practice becoming aware of your emotions and finding language for it, distinguishing between shame and guilt, for instance. You can practice understanding and recognizing your shame triggers. Why? Well, this helps you to predict when it is that you're likely to feel shame and to choose your response more intentionally as a result of that. Shame-resilient people tend to practice critical awareness. In other words, they question their emotional gut reactions, their assumptions about where their worth lies. And finally, Shame resilient people tend to reach out to other people. One of the Christian practices that goes along these lines is the practice of confession. The second exercise, this is your take-home exercise that you did, involved identifying an issue that made you feel bad about yourself. This process involves describing it, and especially thinking about how it makes you feel, and then encouraging you to really feel your emotions. The second part of this exercise was a mindfulness exercise. It drew your attention to how you actually experience these feelings in your body in the moment. And the third part of this exercise was an exercise in compassion. And the way that we tapped into this was to actually try to write a compassionate letter as if it were from a friend. And ideally what you want to do here is to imagine a friend who's unconditionally loving. Also, I encourage you to think about a friend who knows your life history and the limits of human nature. In other words, they can understand why you might have done this and don't see you as an intrinsically flawed person. And to end this, you think about how would they convey their deep compassion for you in the midst of this circumstance or quality. So if I was taking notes on this section, these are a few of the ways that I might jot down these notes so as to better both remember them for the long term as well as to study for that exam. Hopefully this helps you in your studying.